For $5 a month, you can actually see the Thin Green Line interviews and other video content on patreon.com. Just search the Thin Green Line podcast on patreon.com. That's patreon.com, and feel like you're part of the conversation. Join us. Today on the Thin Green Line, episode 2, we have Paul Rella, and Paul Rella's on our show because he's a prepper. And Paul and I go way back before prepping, although I think I've always been kind of a prepper. The first time we met, I was gnawing on something wild and, that's something you probably would prep for the future.
Right.
Paul and I worked together too. I was a game warden and he was a trooper, and we worked in the same area. Paul migrated from city life, not really city life, but migrated to the mountains. They were calling him, so he came to the mountains and was a trooper up there in northern Coas County. And he's got right into this prepping stuff and being self-sufficient, basically, is what it is, isn't it, Paul? More than prepping or being able to survive long-term without the needs of others, really.
Right. Just trying to be ahead of the curve. One thing law enforcement's taught me is can happen to me, can happen to my family. There's no protective bubble around us. I think most people go through life thinking that it always happens to somebody else, or it's going to happen to somebody else in another country, or whatever it is. And I think being in law enforcement, you realize that it can happen to me. There's nothing protecting me, and there's nobody going to protect me except my friends and my family. So in that vein, that's what we started doing, is making sure that we were all set.
Yeah, no doubt. And is that why you moved north? I'm just curious.
Well, after I was in the Marines for 4 years as a military policeman, when I came back, I got hired by a local law enforcement agency. The state police were not hiring at the time. That was my goal, to get on the state police. And I lived in a town that I had neighbors. I had 3 acres, but I had neighbors. It was a neighborhood. And I was always been interested in raising farm animals, and in high school I raised showbirds and nice. Chickens, ducks. I had an incubator, we had horses, stuff like that. But when I got out of the service and I bought my first house, I started raising pigs in my backyard, and started raising turkeys, meat birds, laying heads, stuff like that. It was a little bit too much. There was no ordinance in town against it, but when I couldn't sleep at night because of the stench after the 4th year of raising pigs on a hot summer night and raising pigs in a neighborhood, and it was wafering in, you had to shut the windows. I'm like, I probably need to get out of here. Plus, there was a couple other things that were happening. There's a couple other things that were happening. The town that I was in, just started growing at an unprecedented rate. We got a Walmart, we got a Market Basket, we got Home Depot was coming in. I think
most people love that.
Fried chicken. What's that?
Most people like that when that happens.
No. So I had been a big fan of the North Country. I'd been coming up here snowmobiling. I liked the fact that it was really rural. I liked the fact that there wasn't a Dunkin' Donuts in town. I liked the fact that it was old mom and pop stuff. And when I did eventually get hired by the state police, I told them I wanted to come all the way up to Pittsburgh or, Coas County. And that's exactly where they sent me, settled in Columbia. And I was able to buy pretty much old farmland. And my interest when I came up here was farming, basically, being a police officer and being a gentleman farmer. I like raising my own meat. My wife had a big garden, canned a lot of stuff. At the time that I came up here, I wasn't a hunter. It wasn't until I met you and a couple of the other guys that I work with that I got into the chase, which is a lot more exciting than going out to a pig pen and shooting your pig. So,
right.
It was great to be up here with you guys that had done this all along, and you guys taught me a lot when it came to that.
Yeah, look at the back wall now, man. You're doing good.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Right.
I got into it back there.
I have to admit that some of those are my wife's, but I got into it and she showed an interest in it. I bought her a rifle, and she took off with it, and we both basically put meat on the table whenever we can.
Awesome.
Yeah. And I got a little side story I got to tell you, John, because the house that he bought, when I was patrolling around, a nice big log cabin, it sets off the road. And I used to have my lunch whenever I bought a lunch or something, because I was young game warden back then. I'd buy my lunch and I would go park in this empty house that was just magnificent, sit on the back porch, eat my lunch, and think about buying this place. I'm like, I'll be able to pick this place up for a song. No one will ever buy this place. And, Paul ends up purchasing the house that I used to dream about living in as a young game warden. And it's a pretty cool place. No doubt. So
that was meant to be. Small world. That worked out great.
Yeah.
And then the first time, Paul, when you no, go ahead, bud.
No, it's all you.
I was going to say, Paul, when you talk about prepping and all this preparedness and survival readiness, that's such a hot topic right now, given this national pandemic we've seen, and nothing like it in our generation. Was that really catalyzed when you were a trooper? Because you alluded to that when we first started talking in this broadcast. And then you just, take it kind of to a heavier level after you retired, or was it always kind of in progress throughout your law enforcement career? And what kind of catalyzed it?
I think we started. It was actually a guy that I worked with. Him and another guy started talking about it, and brought up the subject to me. And I'm like, I already have the biggest freezer that any company makes, and I usually butcher a cow a year, and I'm very organized when it comes to, I need to have, even before I started prepping, I liked it when my freezer was full. If the store has whole chickens on sale for 99 cents, I usually go in and buy 10. I don't pay the $2 for them. So I've always liked to have the squirrel away effect kind of stuff that I was doing. But when we started talking about it, and of course I was on nights, and there was a lot of downtime, after 2:00 in the morning. And so we park, one of the guys was a local cop and I was a trooper, and there was another guy that was a trooper. And we just started talking about it. And I really realized how not prepared I was, even though when I started researching stuff, you can't live on deer meat. You know what I mean? You have to have provisions above and beyond just survival skills, really. Especially if you throw a family into the mix. You're going to have to take care of your kids. You're going to have to take care of your wife. And I was even though I was probably more prepared than most, I was very ill prepared. And so then we started, a bunch of us guys that were like-minded. Most of us were jarheads anyway, so we all got along. And so we would meet. We started meeting once a month, having a couple beers, talking about what we wanted to do. And then we started putting a plan into action, and we actually met we did this for 3 to 5 years. I don't remember how long. And in fact, we had stopped, we had gotten to the point where we had so much stuff, we had enough stuff that we could take a break, and maybe focus on some other things. And so, it's a good feeling to be all set. I don't think you could ever be all set, but we felt pretty good in the position that we were in. And kind of our meetings kind of dissolved. I still had, I brought my father into the fold. I have four boys. My oldest boy was living with us at the time, and he got into it. So talk about starting back up. Some of my stuff that I stored right now is going on 20 years old.
Nice.
The stuff that I was interested in storing wasn't the 5-year stuff. A lot of the 5-year stuff you can do without. I was interested in storing stuff that lasted 20 to 30 years.
There you go. Nice.
So that's basically what we focused on. We would actually take notes, and we would, assign something to one guy, assign something to another guy. They'd go research it. We'd have another meeting, and then we'd put that into action. A lot of our meetings, we packed food for 2 hours. Everyone helped. You know what I mean? You bought what you wanted, and that's how we got it done. And over the time, over the years, stuff adds up.
Yeah, that's great. So you guys were on it way in the early days before so much of our, especially North American US public found themselves completely under-equipped when COVID-19 broke out. And now we're seeing this backlash of guys like you, guys like Wayne and I, got military first responders or survivalists, just in general on that thin green line front across the board. Everyone's picking their brains now on, well, what is your load outlook, your bug out bag for the day? What are your long-term stores of food? Right. What are your survival implements if you lose power or you lose gas? And it's interesting to see this wave, kind of at the last minute, kind of panic stricken almost, and all the hype for it. It's just neat to see that, you've done such a killer job of doing it early. When you talk about food storage, Wayne and I got into this when we first co-hosted a Warden's Watch a while ago. And it was actually just when COVID-19 was starting up, before we knew the magnitude. It's one thing to have all that food, like you said, a freezer full of deer meat, all these other, non-perishables, but storing them and sealing them properly for freezer storage to extend life and things like that is critical. What do you use, as far as vacuum sealing, the new Food Saver system, or do you have any recommendations? We share some notes on that.
There's all kinds of different ways that you can do it. Some people save 2-liter soda bottles and dry them out, and they fill it with rice and they cap it so there's no air in it. That'll store rice for a while. We opted to go for a little bit more expensive route that would last longer and would basically impervious to mice. We could bury these things in strategic locations. So nice. Basically what we did was one of the guys that was part of our group was really great on researching this stuff, and had the patience to do it and brought it to the table, brought it to the fold. So we purchased Mylar Bags, which is nice. Very common in this kind of thing. I mean, people use Mylar Bags all the time, but what we did, I think we did a little extra of a step. So we got the product that we wanted that would last the longest. We got what they call oxygen tabs that suck all the oxygen out of the bag, and that's very important too. Those aren't cheap either. So we would pack the food into 5-gallon bags and oxygenate, put the oxygen tab in it, and then you seal it with an iron. You get all the air out of it. You try to seal, you seal it with the iron. And then we went the extra step, and a lot of people will just store those bags on shelves and stuff. We put them all in sealable, food grade hard plastic buckets, 5-gallon buckets. That nice. when you put the top on, it seals. It's airtight, watertight. You can bury them. It doesn't leak. Even if it did leak, it probably wouldn't get in the Mylar bags. The biggest thing is the rodent problem. So that's what we did for all of our dry goods, and it worked out really well.
Nice. Yeah, kind of double redundancy, and the longevity of that's incredible.
Right. Well, what we were thinking of was this. Now, let's say you have 150 buckets. I don't really want to keep all of them at my house. I want them in different locations in case my house burns down.
Right.
My house burns down, I have no food. Not everybody can, afford to get a bunker built. You know what I mean? Sure. So the buckets, they can be stored in other places. You could bury them in locations. You can put them in, throw them in your barn. Mice are not getting in it. You can just have them spread out, which I thought was important because I didn't want everything in one spot.
Nice.
And I'm assuming, Paul, that you buried some somewhere in strategic locations, because you always grin when you say that.
Maybe. Maybe.
Well,
I swear it's my last bucket.
Well, you know what they say, guys, 2 is 1, 1 is none. So you gotta have some redundancy out there, Paul, like you said. And yeah, I think what Wayne's getting at is how many secret, bunker little bury holes do we have? I'll admit to a few in both my old in a couple of states, my previous state and my new state of Montana. There's a few. So because that's the key. That's the key people are missing right now is if your house is taken over in a worst case scenario, whatever that looks like, or it burns down, right? Or you lose it to a natural disaster, something like that. Where most of us, me included, keep the bulk of our survival supplies for that magical number of at least 30 days. In this day and age, I hope people are doing it for 90 days plus. And that's kind of what we've been, Wayne and I have been pushing since this thing started. but a majority of us do keep everything at home or close to the home.
Mm-hmm.
And you bring up a great point of preparing for the, the worst case scenario where, you basically have to live out of a bug out bag in a hidden food
Right.
store. And it's important for us listeners to know that. I appreciate you bringing it up.
Right. The other thing that I felt was important, and this isn't my idea by any means, but I read a lot at when we were doing this. I was, I've had the nickname Overdue. So like I like to tend to overdo things. So one of the things that I read about and I really latched onto, I don't know if it was from my profession or what, but I wanted to have enough that if I did come across somebody that had a couple kids that were starving, say their shit really hit the fan, I want to be able to give that person 20, 30 pounds of rice and not take it from my family.
Right.
And, because especially when there's kids involved, we talked about if someone showed up, depending on their skill level, whether we would let them stay with our group or not, I don't know. What did they bring to the table? You know what I mean?
Sure.
But if we weren't going to let them stay, I'd send them off with something.
Sure.
Anything,
that's great.
You know what I mean? Something that, and so I thought that was important to have that in my stash also.
Well, that puts a little level of humanity in it when we see so much panic and so much fear, eroding support for one another right now all over the country. And I mean, we started to see that the first week of just the announcement of this COVID-19 presence in America, and nothing had even happened yet. Nobody was out of food. There wasn't any rationing. There wasn't any, shelter in place orders, but just the fights I was breaking up in the Bay Area, California, that Wayne and I talked about on a previous show, just because tensions were so high. And, you bring something we haven't heard yet, is bring a little levity to that by bringing a little bit of community. And the bottom line is we got to stick together through this thing, take care of our own first and foremost, of course. But, when you think of prepper and survival mentality, and I do a lot of work with Recoil Off Grid, which is part of my brand and publishing and stuff. And Recoil hits on this, and they, the maximum preparedness, but you see a very fine line between, all for yourself and, we're going to hold everything by force if we need to survive versus, let's give everybody a chance and bring them into the community for a force multiplier. Or if it's not going to work out and you have to make that hard call where, sorry, we don't have enough and we can't sustain you as part of our group, send them with something, and pay it forward. And I haven't heard that yet. It's a neat perspective and something we need these days. So good stuff.
Right. And I just, it was just important to me to be able to be in a position to be able to do that. The other thing we struggled with too, because we were all law enforcement. So a big part of what we struggled with, and we had many conversations on it. One of the guys in the group was the chief of police in the town. One of the other guys was his officer, and we had a bunch of troopers. Well, if let's say, obviously there's a couple different scenarios that, we're talking, EMP strike, or let's say a pandemic like we have now. If society started to collapse, what would our duty be? Would our duty be to close our doors, shut our shades, stay home, or are we going to go out and we're going to try to do what we're hired to do? You know what I mean? So that was a big thing. Some of the guys were like, screw that. I'm taking care of my family. And I'm like, but if the town's on fire and you got a bunch of guys going around that, the guys that we deal with all the time that are just taking advantage of these innocent people, ripping them off and raping and, who knows how far it could go. How can we stand by and let that happen? You know what I mean?
Well, yeah. And that's a great point, because right now, again, when I mentioned those fights and those tensions that were happening the first week of this outbreak, certain Instagram videos I was seeing, like really close to my old Silicon Valley hometown area, California, in San Francisco, the wolves are going to come out, right? And the wolves are going to come out during daylight when they find that the sheep are completely overwhelmed and us sheepdogs aren't around to hold the line. So guys going into Walgreens with hoodies and sunglasses on, unarmed, and just cleaning out counters while everyone just looked at them with their mouths open, jaws on the ground, able to do nothing. And these guys were just laughing at the attendance there as people were taking this video. And that to me was a reminder of what we've all done as first responders, as all of us law enforcement, in Green Line or otherwise. That's it exactly. What are we supposed to do when the wolves come out? And they're out, and they're going to be out. And and I think all three of us on this conversation agree, we're going to protect and we're going to save our communities. It's just, it's in our blood to be sheepdogs. I wouldn't do it any other way.
Right.
But it's definitely a good it's definitely a good debate point. At what point, when your family is in danger because of those sacrifices you're making, if it gets too terminal, and that's something that we can only play day by day. And I hope it never comes to that, but we got to keep in mind that it could.
Yeah, and sheepdogs in rural New Hampshire and rural Montana compared to New York City, and Jersey and LA, a whole different dog.
Well, guys, I'll share a story with you both. Paul, you'll appreciate this, Wayne, just because of our backgrounds and how we're oriented. I talked to, earlier this morning on my trail run behind the house, I talked to Pat Foy, who is a captain with California Department of Fish and Wildlife and our lead PIO for all kinds of networking. And, he's kind of an office guy there in Sacramento in our headquarters office for where our capital is. And he told me, John, in the last 2 months, as this outbreak has broken out, I've run code 3 and dealt with more physical confrontations of trying to de-escalate them either by myself or working with other LE from other agencies than I have in 20 years of my career so far. Tensions are so high. People are getting so fired up on law enforcement right now, dictating where they can and can't go on shutdown orders with, stay at home and not being able to go out. So everyone is just irritated, and it's getting pretty crazy to the point of in the bigger cities like that spot with this pandemic. And to your point, Wayne, what is it like in the big cities? Well, it's everything we don't really see a lot of in our little rural areas on steroids 20 times. And every day it gets a little worse. And it was really good to get his perspective today coming into this podcast, which was eye-opening to everyone's point here. Something we need to get out there and think about.
Right. Yeah, no doubt. And that's what I kept thinking, it changes. And to Paul, me and Paul talked earlier that your preparedness changes being, where you are too. The people in the city become prepared in a different way than we do. So.
Absolutely. If you're in the city, you're not going to survive. You know what I mean? You just, depending on what it is, if, like we talked about, if let's say that there's a pandemic, but it's not COVID, it's something that is like the plague that 60 to 70% of anybody who gets it dies.
Yep.
If that's the case, truck drivers aren't going to work.
Right.
The people at the supermarket are not going to be there. They're not going to be checking you out. So the stores are going to be cleaned out in 2 weeks. And then what? Then what for the people in the cities? You know what I mean? They have a week supply of food at their house, if that. You'll see the in that type scenario, obviously I think we could all agree that society, law would all be broken down into nothing. It would be riots, it would be killings, it would be survival of the fittest, and that's no place you want to be. So we always said that, when I was talking to Wayne, not we always said, but none of us were in that position. We did have a couple guys family members that lived in populated areas. And, we would tell them, you need to see what's coming way before everybody realized what's happened.
Right.
You know what I mean? So I had a cousin that lived in San Diego, and I said, you need to get yourself an older vehicle. That's something that will run if we do have a sunburst or an Emp Strike. We talked about that and get all into what that's all about. But you need to know 2 weeks ahead of time before anybody else realizes it, that you're out of there. And you have to have a place to go. You can't just leave and say, well, I don't have a plan of where I'm going. You've got to have a bug out place to go to. You have to set that up. And a lot of people don't realize that. They just think, well, if it happens, I'll just leave and I'll go up into the country somewhere. Well, you're not going to survive that.
Right. How long can that realistically last? And how short-sighted is that thought? You hear that a lot. That's a good point. Yeah.
Right. You know what I mean? You have to have that in plan. And I would say 99% of the people don't. They think the government's going to come and help them. The food trucks are going to keep coming. The stores are going to miraculously have meat and dairy and stuff in it. And they don't realize that nobody, depending on what happens, if it's a pandemic or a virus that's killing 70% of the people, no matter if you're young, old, whatever, you're on your own. Yeah. Government's not coming.
Yeah, and it would be something in that scenario that would be so exponentially faster in developing than what we're seeing with COVID. But
Right.
the thing that's interesting about COVID is we're only starting to get word, at least publicly on news channels. I know you guys probably get the same thing back there of get ready because the agricultural products, the meat, and the grocery supply chain is about to get extremely limited because the backlash of the accordion on the supply chain even now. And we've had a lot of flattened curves, throughout the country, but we still have a second wave coming.
Right.
And now we're starting to see some of those perishables that are not going to be as available. And we're getting a taste of it. And it could certainly be a lot worse. And we like to count the positives and the blessings through this incident, but it's certainly a wake-up call, isn't it, Paul? It's given us a refresher of what we need to be prepared for, and a huge wake-up call, I think, for not only our country but the world.
Right.
And as Wayne and I have talked about for weeks in these broadcasts, is I hope we don't have short-term memories like we tend to on other incidences worldwide, right?
Right.
So interesting development as this thing continues, and it'll be very interesting to see how bad the supply chain gets, and if those fears and that anxiety elevate to a point where it does become a threat within our public, and hopefully it doesn't.
Well, my opinion on that is that, I hope it doesn't either. As long as you're keeping the people fed, I think that it'll be, other than buying out toilet paper for, a virus that doesn't give you the runs or anything. I can't understand that. But,
Right.
it's just, it's crazy. But, I think that as long as the people are fed, and there may be shortages, but as long as they're fed, I think, stuff will be kept to a dull roar. You may keep it to the 5% that are the bad characters acting out. But if that were to change, I don't think it would take long for society to collapse. And it's not going to collapse in Colebrook where I am. You know what I mean? It can get a lot worse, but it's really not going to collapse. But in the cities where you have so many people and so little resources for food and stuff, it's going to be out of control, and nobody's going to be coming to help. So therefore, if you live in the city and you got a family member that lives in the city, they have to have a plan to get out. So that was my point with that.
Yeah, one of the, to your point on that too, guys. One of the things that's interesting is several members on my old special ops team in Fish and Wildlife that I've been keeping in touch with, because we were in California when this broke out. And then we made the migration, timed it very carefully, because we had business and first responders and hospital staff in the family that had things they had to do there. And then we had to make the migration up here to Montana, and as quickly as we could. But like you said, knowing when exactly to make the launch, where if you leave too early, it might be premature and you might not be able to do as much as you should to help people around you in a community. But if you leave too late, it's just that, it's too late.
You might not get out.
You might not get out, and we started to see this problem start to happen, especially in the big cities, Silicon Valley, LA, San Diego, where you just mentioned having a friend from, the LA basin especially, and keeping in touch with people down there to see how quickly it eroded once certain news breaks happened. And
you had said that, John. You had said, I want to get out of here before, if it gets any worse, and they happen to close the state borders or something like that.
Yeah.
You're like, I'm just. He's like, if it gets any worse, I want to be ahead of it, not behind it. I remember that whole conversation. So
yeah, well, and it's funny you triggered that, Wayne, because Wayne and I were doing a broadcast, and I was doing it from my RV. And going, okay, I'm literally, it wasn't even the days anymore. I was watching the hours, like what happened in the afternoon on the news. And obviously, being in law enforcement my whole career, like you guys, I've seen short-term panics, and we saw 9/11 and we responded to that and different things similar to that. But something that had this unknown was such a different concept. And then just to vibe being around large populations of people and hearing what they had to say, seeing what they were doing, watching the body language and the nervousness and the anxiety, putting them on edge early on, that was a real wake-up call. And, and got us talking about, are we really prepared? And Wayne and I both agreed, we're pretty well stocked, but we're not ready to the extent of this thing going past a month, let's say. And for you guys already being up in, thank heaven you guys were in your rural spots. For me, it was like, man, I just need to get that 1,200 miles to the promised land, because you mentioned a place to go, the rally point. It's, it's here for us and family members. But But it was anxiety ridden, man. I got to say, tensions were pretty high, and I was in, escape and survival mode, like we all like to be, but it was for real. It wasn't just running a drill in my head with all the over prepared gear we've stored up, right, Paul and Wayne, and
right.
all the stuff. And it's interesting to see it actually come into play and then learn what we were lacking. And you're bringing a lot of good tips to the table that I did not even consider today. And man, it's great to hear this from you. We appreciate it.
Yeah, you remember that movie Stripes, Paul? Stripes.
Yeah.
Stripes. Remember the RV and Stripes? That's how I picture John's RV. So if we get some younger guys listening to this, just watch that movie Stripes. It's pretty entertaining. Bill Murray. It's a good, but that's all I can picture John's RV like. So
just answering my retirement. I'm making flapjacks all day and doing podcasts. What else do you do in retirement, man? In our generation, guys, come on.
Paul, you mentioned salt is a really important staple.
Yeah.
As far as prepping.
Yeah, salt. A lot of people don't. A lot of people don't realize. I mean, that's why you have to do your research. You can't just store a bunch of macaroni and stuff and call it good. But salt is one of the things that I didn't even know this until we started doing it. Is that salt started? They started putting iodine in salt in the 1920s because most Americans were deficient in iodine. And the problem with that is that unless you live near the ocean and you're eating a lot of seaweed and you're eating a lot of fish, you're going to be iodine deficient in your diet. And that causes all kinds of problems. It's very important for pregnant women to have enough iodine because it's the development of the brain of the baby. And it regulates your thyroid gland, which it regulates all of your hormones. And I guess they call it goiter. You can get goiter if you don't have enough iodine. And you can't get it like where I live. I don't live near the ocean. Even if I did, I probably couldn't eat enough of it to do me any good. So you have to store iodized salt, and you have to store a lot of it because we went one step further with, what if there was a Emp Strike and we lost our electricity? Well, one of the things, and we talked about this, Wayne, was one of the things that we did was we want to have a couple hundred canning jars on hand because I have a freezer that's full and I'm going to now have to start canning my meat. In addition to that, I want to salt some of my meat too. You know what I mean? So I want to have enough salt for that, make some jerky or do whatever. So you have to have the plan to do that. I probably would can most of it. But as far as the salt goes, I can't get that around here. There's no salt caves. There's no salt mines. You need to have that. You need to buy the stuff that's iodized. You can go online and you can look at what happens to you if you don't have any. And it's not
iodized salt being something we don't often think about for long-term preparedness, but it's a huge issue and amounts that are a lot more than I even thought about. Can you talk a little bit about that and what recommendation you would make for our listeners for how much iodized salt they should store for a situation beyond what we're experiencing in, say, COVID, and what's the amount and for how long?
Well, salt's one of those things that you can store indefinitely as long as it doesn't get wet. And as we talked about, it doesn't go bad. It doesn't. It's an indefinite item. So there is a breakdown of how much per person you're going to need per year and all that stuff. And I didn't go by that. I just kept buying it and I kept storing it. And what we talked about, and I don't know if you need the iodized salt because you can get something called goiter if you do not have iodine in your daily diet. And it's really found in nothing other than, some fish. There's a small amount of it in other foods, but not enough for a human being to not get sick. So it's just very important that you add that people add that to their food supply and actually use it, when, you salt your food, and you have to look, some salt is not iodized. So you have to make sure when you're storing the stuff and packing it, you're buying the iodized salt.
Gotcha. And you were saying a couple 100 pounds is a good bet if you can get that much. That'll give you some longevity through pretty much any crisis.
Right. That's what we figured. Like I said, I probably stored a little bit more than I needed, but I did that with just about everything only because I don't know, makes you feel better. Have more than you need.
Right? Hey man, good to be good. Right in a place where overdoing it is not a bad thing, man.
Right.
So kudos for overdoing it. Besides salt, buddy, what would you give like?
I want to stay back at the salt thing because I think back to the Roman days, salt was like a currency, and someday could be a currency again too.
Yes.
That's kind of interesting that salt was a currency in the Roman times, and possibly if a currency ever went and salt was that important again, might be a currency. Maybe you're stashing gold away, Paul.
Right.
Yeah. And Wayne, to that point, trade value, just when things like cash systems are gone, ATMs and electronic payment is gone, we're going back to the Stone Age, and we're going to be bartering for goods that we need, right?
Absolutely.
So that's a huge point. Good one. Yeah.
There's a guy in a few towns just over from us who's started a Facebook like trading site. So bartering type thing, instead of money, and it's taken off like astronomically during this thing. So there's no exchange of money. People need this, they don't need that, and they've been exchanging, and that's taken off really quite well in the North Conway area. So that's kind of neat thing. We're going back. We're going backwards. We're going back to our roots. So which might
not be a bad thing.
No, yeah, I agree. I don't think it is a bad thing. I think that we guys have been so far from our roots of relying on ourselves. And Paul, what you bring to the table today of that preparedness and having a plan and thinking ahead when survival is a day to day. When we're not in urban centers where we have Amazon, one button shopping and things show up at the door, and we don't hunt, we don't gather, we're not conservationists. I mean, we are the lost percentage of real hunters and gatherers and actually surviving on what Mother Nature offers us and not manipulating technology. There's so few of us left, I think. And to the point of this whole discussion, that's a very good point, guys, in that we don't think about this enough and we don't do it enough, and we should actually. This is a perfect point in time to do it.
Right. I think this is a huge reset for a lot of people and for our country, that we need to do things differently. We can't rely on faraway places for the stuff that we need. I think it's just a reset, and hopefully we've learned from it and we don't forget about it in a year.
And on levels far beyond survival, you just hit it on the head, Paul, when you said relying on goods from other places that we can't do in-house. Right. And I know, without getting too political on this thing, this has been a big issue with the COVID-19 outbreak of how reliant we are with, a foreign power. Not only from the standpoint of the origin of the virus, but everything from our debt to our, inexpensive supply chain. It is a wake-up call, and I hope we don't forget. We see some changes globally on all these subjects, not just how we're prepared to survive the backlash when it doesn't work.
Right.
So, Paul, top 10 things to have to prepare.
Well, obviously food is one of them. Okay. You gotta have enough food. You gotta be able to eat.
And how do you think how long for food? What should we prepare for? You said a year, 2 years, 3 years. I know you overdo it, so I'll cut it in half.
I know. My opinion is a minimum of 3 years that you do not have to leave your house.
Okay.
Wow. Okay.
That's a lot of food, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's worst case scenario where there is a pandemic that if you have any contact with anybody, you're probably going to catch it and you're going to die.
Yeah. So you're truly isolated.
Yeah. Sealed right off. I mean, Emp Strike, that's a totally different thing. If we're knocked back 500 years, you're going to be able to have community. You're going to be able to, once you weed out the bad apples, you're going to be able to set up the good people will come together. That will be a totally different response. I mean, you got a lot of different scenarios, but food, very important. We obviously firearms and ammunition was another top priority that we had on our list. We went so far. We had about 4 families that were gonna, depending on what happened, obviously if there's a pandemic, then there's certain part of quarantine until we know that we're good, that we could come together. Obviously, if it's an EMP strike, we could come together right away because there's no chance of catching something. But we figured that a good plan is obviously to have a few families involved in where you're going to homestead, because you're going to need the protection of the additional people. You're going to need the additional labor, and you also want to have the same type weapons with the same type calibers.
Yes.
You know, let's say everyone has a 45 caliber handgun, and then everybody else wants, everybody, for rifles, we have M16s with the interchangeable magazines. So everybody's on the same page. We don't have to store a bunch of different kinds of ammo. We all have the same. We have the same rifle ammo, same sidearm ammo. The other thing that we found that was very important, that we thought that, I mean, very important, is having 22 rifles.
Yeah.
First of all, the ammo is very cheap, and you can store thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of rounds of 22 ammo. Mm-hmm. And a 22 rifle is a great weapon for hunting. I mean, we're not hunting buffalo. Yeah,
quiet.
Right. We're not hunting buffalo. You know, if you're going to be, you know, you could take 15 pounds of rice or 20 pounds of rice for your family and shoot a couple squirrels and have a really nice meal. So you're not going to be shooting a squirrel with a 30-06 or your M16. So, I mean, and a 22 is good for all sorts of stuff. And not only that, worst case scenario, I wouldn't want to get shot with a 22. I mean, it can be used for personal defense too. I mean, 22s are devastating to the head. You know what I mean? And you could give, you know, here's the other thing. You got, you know, 14, 15-year-old boys that are with your homestead. You give them 22 and a box of shells, 10 shells, go out and get us some dinner. Go get a couple rabbits, go get whatever. So we felt that the 22s were very important to have, pistols and rifles. Whether they're bolt action or whatever, bolt action probably would be the best, more accurate. But we decided on that. So ammunition. We also, I thought was kind of important too. We bought a bunch of surgical kits. We bought dentistry stuff. So, so like, you know, okay, shit's hit the fan. There's no dentist around, but I'm going to have my buddy yank a tooth that's really hurting me, or even just for a yearly cleaning. Anybody can figure out how to do that. So, you know, you get the little pick of dental hygiene. We also, I didn't talk about this either, but, you know, storing, you know, every time you go to Rite Aid, buy a toothbrush, put it in your cache, you know what I mean? Buy some, you know, is toothpaste as important as a toothbrush? I don't know. I think the toothbrush is more important, but, you know, stuff like that. One of the people that we did this with, and I wouldn't suggest this, I didn't do it, but every time they went to the store, they grabbed a couple napkins. You know, if they went to Dunkin' Donuts, they grabbed a couple napkins. And the amount of toilet paper, napkins, whatever you want to use it for, that this guy had, you wouldn't believe it. You wouldn't believe it, and it was all free. Because I'll take that, you know. So, and that, I mean, you know, we're talking over a period of 5 years, let's say 3 to 5 years that we did this. And, you know, his stuff, he had huge amount of paper products. You know, that's a convenience thing, because if worst case scenario, if you know, you got to go wipe your ass with leaves, that's what you do. You know what I mean? But as far as a convenience issue, I mean, that's really nice. The other thing that people should think about, I didn't have this issue, you know, but I mean, I had 4 boys, but one of the guys in the group had girls. So he started stocking up on sanitary napkins, you know, just makes life better. You know what I mean? Once, I mean, I wouldn't say to stock up on those before you have enough food, but once you get to the threshold that you have enough food and your ammo is pretty set, you can start going after the coffee, right? You start getting the coffee that you want to start storing, maybe some tea bags. You want to start doing some of the stuff that's going to make life just a little bit easier, but not necessary. We had friendly with the local doctor, and I wasn't at this one meeting, but he taught some of the guys how to suture. They practice on raw chickens. How to, if somebody got a pop, you know, how to suture that. You know, that's another, you know, these are kind of the things that we were thinking about after we were just really getting all set, you know. And it was like, we bought shortwave radio, has the same radio. Thinking, you know, of communication. sadly, we never went any further with that to get our license to do that. I mean, it wouldn't matter during a pandemic or the end of the world scenario to have a license. Who would give a shit? But
right.
There is an art to doing that, and we didn't follow that up as much as we should. That's an area that I wanted to do a little bit more with. I'd like to have this is another thing about overdoing. I collect knives, and and I know you're a knife guy, John, because I listened to your podcast today with Wayne. I know you're making knives, so I'll have one of them soon. But
we'll set you up, man.
You can't have enough knives.
It's so true, especially in this scenario. Yep.
You can't have enough knives, even if it's a fact that people showing up, they don't have a knife, so you give them one. And so I have a lot of knives that I probably, being my age, I probably don't need to even sharpen them. I can just go grab a new one.
Yep. I know the feeling. I got a box full of.
Yeah.
and Paul and Wayne, we always grab that low end knife. That you get at giveaways, you get at conventions. It's got a decent edge, and that's my box cutter, right?
Yeah.
I don't bring out my signature blade. I don't bring out an Ernie Emerson or anything like that, man. It's funny you say that, dude. Kindred spirits. That's
right.
Good.
Right. So, I mean, that's, the knives that I get, I look for a certain thing. A lot of people don't even know what a full tang knife is.
Right.
And all the knives that I collect or I have are full tang, so they don't break off. I had a knife that broke off halfway when I was a kid. I don't know what I was doing. I was stabbing a log or something, fooling around, and it broke off and it cut my hand. And it wasn't a full tang. So I got this thing about full tang. I have to have a full tang knife, unless it's a full tang knife.
Sure.
But so I buy the full tang knives that are pretty much indestructible. You can hit them with a sledgehammer. You can, once they get dull, do whatever you want. Open cans with them. So that's another thing that I did on my own of collecting that. The other thing that there's obviously a lot more stuff to it, but those are pretty much the big points. The other thing that we did, and merely for survival, especially up in the Northeast, this wouldn't be as important if you're in the southern state, but obviously we're going to need cut firewood in the winter or in the summer for the winter because it gets cold.
Yep.
So who the hell just wants one chainsaw? I mean, if I had to do it with a two-man saw, okay, that's fine, but as long as I can get fuel, which that's another whole thing of storing fuel, but
sure.
10 spark plugs for your chainsaw, 10 air filters, have enough oil for the bar, you know what I mean?
Yep.
Stuff like that. And so we stored that. If your chainsaw has, my buddy was better at this than me, but it's electronics. If it has a little CDI box or whatever that runs the spark, get a couple of those and put them in a hardened container. Just in case it was and the same thing with vehicles. I have two vehicles that are pre-1980.
Nice.
Not only and when I first got those, it wasn't because of prepping. It was just because I like them. I'm an international
cool
scout,
classic.
man. I like international scouts, and so I have two of those, and if an EMP goes down, we know that all of our new cars are not going to work. Anything with a computer is not going to work. So you want to get distributor caps, you want to get some extra spark plugs, and you want to put them in a hardened container also, just so that that vehicle is going to be able to work. Especially when at the time that we started doing this, I had a son in college, and he was in Concord, which is 3.5 hours away. So we had a whole plan to get him out of there in case something happened. Right down to, we wanted him to not shelter in place. We wanted him to start heading home, and he was to walk up the south side of the highway, and he had ribbon, and I wanted him to put a ribbon every couple of miles. So in case we went past his location, I didn't want him walking in the road, walk off the road, but on the guardrail, tie a ribbon. So I know that if I see that ribbon going south to get your ass, that I've gone too far, I need to turn around and look for you. So that's a whole other aspect of planning this. If you have family members that you want to come back, how are you going to get them back? He wasn't going to go to school in California because he wouldn't be coming back.
Good call.
You know what I mean? Right? There's no way I'm doing that.
Yeah. Point.
So that you guys broke up a little bit there. I didn't hear if you had a question or.
Yeah, I think.
No, I was just starting to stop for people to think about, because I think we all could tune that list up a little bit, even those of us that think we're.
Yeah, I think our Montana link is a little.
Yeah, it said it was his bandwidth was low. That's what it just flashed on my screen.
It'll probably.
He is in Montana.
Yeah. You're a little glitchy, John, but I think it's straightening out. So everybody's getting off the internet now. All the kids are getting done with school. So hopefully, nope, there you go. We lost connectivity.
No, I'll be right back, guys. I'm just checking my internet, and it looks looks good.
Okay.
There we go.
It's everything in between. That's what I've found out. Yeah.
Okay.
That today, but interesting. So so we do that. I'd like to kind of go over bug out bags, and you certainly can jump in, John. What should somebody have? And if we go over time, we can make this 2 episodes too, which would be good. But the bug out bag, what to have in there and how to plan that. And you've kind of planned on how to get your family back too, which is way beyond anything I have ever thought of. Of course, my family is still focused. I don't have kids here and there, but there's a lot of when I think of prepping, I just think of a guy that squirrels away a bunch of food. I don't think of all this other planning. And one thing we didn't mention, Paul, that you kind of blew my mind with was the canning jars. So
yeah,
we went through this whole scenario, John, that he asked me. He's like, "You got a freezer just like I do, full of meat," and I'm like, "Yep." And he's like, "Well, so when the power goes out, what's going to happen?" And I said, "Well, the generator kicks on and it keeps the freezer cool because I got that wired in." He's like, "Yeah, when you run out of fuel for your generator, what are you going to do?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm going to throw all that."
Yeah, that truth. That. Yep.
So I'll let you take it from there, Paul, because you told me what to do from there, and I just had never thought of it.
Right. So you should have in your stash a couple hundred cans, canning jars. They do sell reusable lids. We have tried those. They're okay. Or you could just buy a couple thousand lids if you want. You know what I mean? Because when you can something, you use the lid once. You can use the jar again, but you can't use the lid again.
Right.
Okay? So it doesn't make a proper seal. They did start making resealable lids, and we have used those, but I think the metal ones are better. Just use them once, throw them away. So let's just say that does happen. You're going to need to store that food, and in the future too. So let's say that happens, and the electricity is just not coming back on. Whatever you're going to be shooting, whatever you're going to be killing, whatever, if you can get a cow and you're going to butcher the cow, how are you going to preserve that? You're going to want to can it. You're going to be forced to can everything so that to get through the winter months or whatever. So having the canning jar is very important. We even talked about, and it wasn't an issue for me because I already had one, but what convenience again, because you could always go outside and make a fire and put the pot on the fire and do. But if you have an electric stove, get rid of it and get a gas stove and get a bigger gas tank, and make sure that you have your gas company fill that several times a year so it's always pretty much topped off.
Yeah.
Because just for the convenience of boiling, I mean, if anyone's ever canned stuff, having a gas stove is some handy instead of doing it over a fire. Right. And your gas stove's going to work. Even if your igniter doesn't work, you can light it with a match. So really no moving parts to that. So that's another thing. Get rid of your electric range and get a gas stove. Eventually that's going to run out, but for let's say this is going to happen, the country's going to be down for a year or two. If you have a big enough tank, you're going to have your stove for a year or two. You know what I mean? So I thought that not necessary. Like I said, you can make a fire outside and put a pot over it, but how convenient would it be not to have to do that?
Right.
So important to have canning jars. And it's also important too that you know how to can. Don't just think I'm going to can when it happens. You're not going to be able to get on the internet and figure it out. So have some books, try it out. We had one of the guys in our group, one of his assignment was to start canning chicken and turkey. And so he'd bring his canned chicken and turkey to a meeting, and it was okay. You know what I mean? And it lasted. And, so it's different than canning vegetables. So you just got to know how to do that. Don't wait for the last minute to have the material to do that. Put together a 3-ring binder with how do I can meat? How do I can chicken? Because I think the chicken is different. You have to do it longer. Have all that stuff that you can just pull it out and don't have it on your laptop.
Yeah.
Right. Have it.
Stuff.
A 3-ring binder isn't going to run out of electricity. So I would say that's pretty important too, to have that on hand, because if something happens, you're not going to be able to get canning jars.
Right.
You might be able to go to the store and clean them out, but everybody else might have the same idea too, just like with this toilet paper.
Yeah. Or right now, yeast, making bread and stuff. I have friends that bake their own bread, and they can't find yeast anywhere. And when they find it, it's 5 times the price that they normally pay. So it's a pretty expensive back. So
they haven't had yeast in Colebrook since this happened. And the yeast that they did have was pizza dough yeast, which is different. It's different than bread yeast. But there's also a way that you could keep a yeast grow going and keep reusing it. So that's another skill that's lost. I mean, so you have a pile of dough and you just keep taking from it, and it breeds itself. And, and here's a little fun fact for you. Supposedly at the Wild Turkey Distillery, they've had the same yeast batch breeding since the early 1900s.
I'll be darned.
They have not introduced any new yeast to that.
Very, very interesting. Huh.
Yeah.
Use turkey fertilizer.
What's that?
Do they use turkey fertilizer too?
I wish. The other thing that we stored too, or that I did, we went and bought a whole bunch of real cheap half gallons of whiskey.
Nice.
Cases of it. And we figured that would be a great barter tool, because if you have somebody that's been dry for 4 or 5 months and they have a box of ammo I want, or they have something that I want, let's say a water pump or something that I need, a bottle of whiskey might go a long way. It might go more than a bucket of rice.
Big time.
But it's nice to have both. The other thing I didn't mention either was wherever you're going to homestead or stage or whatever, you have to have a water source.
Right.
Your pump's not going to work. You got to plan on your pump not working. The best case scenario is if you have a dug well that is a really good dug well. Obviously you can go if you're on a river, that's another situation too. But most people don't live on rivers, so or bodies of water. So having a nice and that's something that you could even do yourself if need be. You might be able to dig your own in a case scenario, but you should have that in place because it's so important. Have it in place as part of your prep. Don't wait for something to happen to say, okay, well, now where are we going to get our water? Even walking down the road to somebody else's well isn't gonna fly for the long term. So it might be a little expensive, might cost you a couple $1,000s, but if you have a property that you guys know that you're going to be going to, whatever, make sure that has a well that you can lower a bucket in and get some water that's clean.
Yep.
Yeah, or a hand pump. That's the other thing I was thinking.
Right.
You could just take that, pull your pump out and slide the hand pump in and use that, because that would be handy. But
you never know how much water you go through if you go to a camp that doesn't have running water.
Yeah, it's a freaking eye opener,
right?
Or what you consume dry camp, and the same thing when I built up here in Montana. We have a great well, a kind of an underground lake of excellent water at about 165 feet, but everything was on electric power to pump that well to the cabin of the main house. So we did the 1,000-gallon propane tank, the generator backup, the Generac tank that I could turn on and off. It didn't have to stay on all the time, but it could pump water. And if we absolutely had to, we could probably put a sump way down there, but we didn't have that, and my dad and all the relatives on the whole property, and they've been settled here for 30 years, and the whole 9 yards is kind of the family sanctuary for a problem like we're experiencing now. And I thought, wow, this is going to be interesting in 30 days when no one's got any juice to get all this great water we have just under the surface.
Right.
And it's something to think about that I did not think about until we made the big move, and people are hitting me up with questions on that same system now. So for our listeners out there and our viewers, pay heed to it, because even in the most rural spots, it can be very, very tough to get water, and obviously in the urban centers as well.
Yeah, and clean water. I mean, it's got to be clean.
Mm-hmm.
Right. To key point for sure.
So you might need a sanitizer or something, a little water pump that cleans it, or a clean water source.
Right.
So same as animals, food, water, shelter, fundamentals, basics.
Right.
They do.
Right.
And then we add all those amenities onto it after.
Right.
So,
right. Basically, you get your food, you get your ammo all set, and then you can start worrying about, like I said, some of the other stuff. I mean, I failed to mention water, so I just brought that up. But, that's, I guess, a person could live, 30 days without food, but only 3 days without water. So that's high priority. And, the other thing that we started, stocking up on, some of the niceties too is, bleach. We started stocking up on gallons of bleach. We started stocking up on gallons. They don't come in gallons, but they come in lesser amounts. But lamp oil, how nice is it to have lamp oil? Because batteries aren't going to last forever.
Right.
So we, and lamp oil, believe it or not, I don't know, Wayne, if you ever tried to buy lamp oil in the North Country, it's extremely difficult to find. So it just is. I don't know, so every time I went down to Gorham or whatever, went to Walmart, I'd buy them out. I started going to a lot of yard sales and buying the old Deeds lanterns, stuff like that. Just
wicks
to have
too.
a light source when it's dark, So I got tons of those things, and got the fuel to use them, because they're useless without the fuel. So that's another thing that we started storing. Like I said, got cases and cases of cheap whiskey. I noticed that there was a few missing from one of the kids during high school, during his senior year.
I'm sure he bartered that. Are we going to unlock here? Oh, usually by now it's unlocked.
Comms back up?
Yep. I don't know what did that.
I'm hearing you. Okay, Wayne, I got you.
Yep, we're all back up. So internet connection.
Yeah, well, it doesn't help. Like I said, it is an absolute blizzard at my house right now. So maybe I got a little bit of, it's winter is just hanging on.
Yeah, and I was the last man standing. You guys all locked up on me, so I'm like, is that me, you? But just we and John talk about the technology all the time. We wouldn't be able to do this. So still kind of neat, and it adds something to have the visual too, and we can certainly give that to some of the people that are on our pay site, the membership only site. So that's pretty something that they would like too. So. But yeah, the bug out bags, I'm hoping we get enough connectivity so we can talk about bug out bags, because that's something, it's pretty important.
Right.
So,
do you want John or I to talk about that?
Well, I think you guys can compare notes.
Yeah. Paul, give us your twist on it. And I'll just interject. How's that?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So basically, we have a bug out bag, a smaller version in each vehicle. So if something were to happen, let's say you're coming back from work or Concord and sun flash, EMP, something happens and your vehicle dies, grab your bag. You're going to have a couple days of food in it. You're going to have ammunition, and you're going to have your firearm in it. Okay, well, firearm's not in it. My wife and I, we have our firearms in our center console, however you're carrying them. So you're going to have protection. You're going to have food. In that, you want to put a compass in there. Some people put a radio to find out what's going on. I didn't feel, you have to use it for your situation. We both work in town. If something happened, we could walk home.
Right.
We're 7-8 miles from town. The only issue would be is if one of us went out of town for work or to do something. Obviously when I was a trooper, that I could be an hour and a half, 2 hours away, but I wasn't really worried about that too much when I was on the job. And I set up the kids with those too. And your bug out bag for your house. Now, obviously, if you're, like we talked about, living in a city and that you're going to be ahead of the curve and you're getting the hell out of Dodge and you're going to a determined location. Well, hopefully that predetermined location already has your food stash at it. and all the stuff that you've been prepping,
Right.
and you've been setting that up. You're not going to be able to carry all that stuff with you. But your bug out bag that you're going to throw in your car, you might want to have a tent in it. You might want to have, obviously, rations, MREs, food. You want to have, I think the best invention is a water purifier straw, where you don't have to haul water, but you can go to any dirty puddle and drink. And, those things are relatively cheap to have, and they filter hundreds of gallons before you have to throw them out. Get a couple of those. Obviously, you got your firearms, your ammo, flashlight, maybe a hand crank radio just to see what's going on. Obviously, if you're going to be able to throw this bag in your car and go, you could have it bigger than if you're going to put it on your back and have to walk out. So you kind of modify it depending on the situation. If your vehicle ain't running and you're on foot, that's a bad situation to be in, but it's going to have to be a little less than what you can throw in your car. So, I mean, I change of clothes, maybe some powder. If you're walking a lot, you want to, if your feet start getting blisters, you're going to be down. You're not going to be able to walk. You know what I mean? So, I learned that in the service, powder your feet every 5 miles. Otherwise, you're going to have guys down. So, stuff like that, I would put in that kit. Any kit that I had, any bug out bag that I had, I want stuff to fish with. I want
Absolutely.
I want some lures maybe, but I want some basic stuff that I can drop a line into a body of water and maybe catch some sustenance to keep going. You know what I mean? Obviously, you want to have a knife. You want to have like a saw. You want to have, like I said, all that stuff. You're going to have to, if you're a 140-pound guy, you might not be able to take as much as, a 220-pound guy. But if you have the basics, food, firearm, your drinking straw so that you can drink water, your flashlight for at night, because maybe you might be traveling at night and sleeping during the day, hunkering down if there's people around, bad guys around, you know what I mean? So you might be traveling at night, obviously you're not going to be using a flashlight to show everybody where you are at, but a flashlight does come in handy in case you get injured or something like that. You got to tend to a wound, whatever. Obviously a compass, I wouldn't rely on it. I mean, at the time I didn't rely on GPSs. I use a GPS for hunting now and I love it. Super reliable, but who knows if the satellites are going to be working, right? Does an EMP strike take out the satellites? I don't know that information. Probably does. So a hard compass. I always take a hard compass with me, anyways, even when I hunt. I don't rely on
as a backup.
Yep. Always have my compass. And a lot of times, I'm looking at my GPS. I'm like, there's absolutely no way that's right. I'll take out my compass, and it's right because I trust my compass.
Done that. Learned. Trust the GPS. I know it doesn't seem right, but it's always right.
And the big thing too, and we didn't discuss this at the time, and it wasn't big, but you guys know the big thing in law enforcement now is tourniquets.
Big time.
And I added that just recently I didn't buy one, but I added that to my list of things to do. I got to get a couple tourniquets. So that's another huge thing. And you can modify that list to whatever you want, but as long as you have the basics,
right.
And a plan, gotta have a plan.
Yeah.
And you have to have the plan prior to it happening.
Yeah, because you're right. You can't play catch up when you have to use your bug bag. It's that moment. But your list is almost identical to one I put several things you mentioned that were really critical and new to the bug out bags. Whether it be tourniquets or an Israeli bandage, something to deal with really hard trauma. Not a bee sting, not a little cut, but a broken bone, a puncture wound, whether it be a stabbing or, things do get Western, so to speak, and it's that bad gunshot. Hot bags previously didn't really include that for the layman or the laywoman rather, and it needs to. And when you mentioned flashlights, especially for operating at night, that's one of those things that I think gets left out a lot because there is safety in darkness. I've always added, besides having a small LED, very low draw with redundant batteries, and whether it's my side satchel or my vehicle bug out bag, having that handheld light, but a headlamp, a headlamp or even two headlamps. Cause I've just found that in the advent of all the operations we've done on the law enforcement side and being a hunter like you guys and navigating where I got to be hands-free, in pitch blackness, hiking into a snow blind or something at 4 a.m, man, those headlamps to be hands-free are just so amazing to navigate. And like you said, brother, if you are navigating at night to stay off the wolves' radar, so to speak, and you're having to illuminate certain, trail indicators here and there, or deal with the wound, or deal with looking over a map or reading your compass. Those are real good critical things to have. But the rest of the list was like, I was just checking all the boxes of the stuff I put out there. So it's good stuff thinking about it. And actually, when we made that big push from California, all the way up here to Montana, it was pretty interesting because I hadn't looked at my bug out bags in a while. I hadn't really checked what was in the truck, what was in the car, what our trauma supplies look like, even though we have trauma professionals all over in the family, and they were lacking in a couple spaces. So it was scampering to find those supplies just in case. And it was a good fire drill. None of it was needed, of course, because it didn't get that crazy. It was just a smooth ride, but it was kind of nice to have a little bit of adrenaline going on, an urgency in real time, and not just, all those years that you're like yourself preparing and thinking about it, having great meetings on it. But now we're actually starting to test the waters of putting this into motion a little bit, fortunately without any hazards coming to anybody. So it was eye-opening, but great list, man. Good stuff.
Yeah,
thanks.
Certainly a great way to start thinking about it and putting this stuff together. If you don't have it together, or adding to what you have, and looking for further out, this is a good shot across the bow, I think, for all of us.
That's it.
Right?
Probing fire has hit us in the woods.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I got to say, I never, and I wouldn't want to. I'm not saying that I wanted this to happen. The EMP strike. I mean, I somewhat lived my life back like 100 years ago, anyways. But the thing that scares me the most is what's going on now. If something were to happen with the pandemic that's much worse than this, like I said, with the 50 to 80% kill rate of everybody, that's the thing that scares me the most. And even with all this stuff, I don't know if you could survive that, depending on how catchy it was or whatever. But that's the scariest part. I don't know about for you guys, but an unseen enemy is what scares me the most.
Mm-hmm.
I agree. It's absolutely the worst. And I mean, this kid, and how many times it's morphed, right? And how many times it's changed. I think a scientist in the family, a medical scientist actually in my family out in Silicon Valley, just said this thing has mutated 8 times. Just the COVID virus. And this isn't like, an anthrax where it's a bioweapon that just kills almost instantly. And we know there's more of it being made out there, not playing the paranoid conspiracy theorist guy, but we know bioweapons are being engineered all over the world. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of worse stuff, Paul, and Wayne, to your guys' point, than COVID-19. This is, I really, I'm kind of putting out the word that I think this is, Wayne, you said it really well, a shot across the bow, or this is probing fire just to see what comes back. And I hate to say it, but I don't think this is the first and only time we're going to see this, in this next generation. And I agree with you 100%, Paul. We really need to think about a worse case than what we're in right now. And this is a good testing bed.
Right.
Did you have masks in your kit, Paul, as far as
no,
the N95 mask? No.
We did have gas masks. I've been buying gas masks with some of the filters that do filter out pathogens. But there too, I have 3 or 4. Well, there were 6 people in my family. So, there you go. And point taken, I don't know where you go to get a kid's mask at the time. Now all my kids are adults. So that's another thing that, but what are you going to do? Walk around with that mask all the time, 24 hours a day?
Right.
It's, if it's something that's airborne, or if it's something that, they taught us in the service, they have bombs that will go off, and they have infected mosquitoes that fly out of the capsule and to spread disease that way, so the mask, so I mean, there's so many different scenarios. But I think, the being able to breathe wasn't as important to us because we are in such a rural area that unless there was a cloud of this stuff coming at you, we don't have to have contact with a bunch of people.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Makes sense.
Yeah. I think that's one of the best things, guys, is where we're all at in the country right now. We have that advantage that the urban population centers don't. And Paul, to your point, when you said, have a plan, have a route, and have a destination, have an Alamo, have a rally point, whatever that is. Right. And it's got to be where you have fresh air and where you have circulation, just for a bioweapon issue. chemical or even nuclear. So that's a really good point. We don't really discuss, and we kind of take for granted, those of us that live out here. But
right.
I'm sure you guys are certainly getting a lot of inquiries if you have relatives in the city and you're keeping in touch with them like I am, and just they're holding their breath homes or track homes or apartments, and if we're very lucky, we don't have to deal with that. But that's the majority of our population in the country and what they're going to have to face.
Right. And the other scary thing is that I think it's something like 90-something% of the food is produced by 2% of the population. And that's a scary scenario there. If something were to happen, to the farmers, and thinking 90% of the food is produced by 2% of the people. Yeah. That's not comforting.
Nope, I think it's a resurgent in gardens this year and canning. And with yeast gone, people are making their own bread. Speaking of farmers, my buddy who's a dairy farmer in New York just sent me pictures of him dumping milk out. I know he's going to be crying because he he's not getting paid for it, but there's no market right now. So he pulled the plug on the bulk tank and let it run. And knowing Steve, he's going out of his mind because he's like, if I don't get a government handout, it isn't going to last. So those 2% are going to be stressed out because of this, and because we shut down so many things, the schools, the sources that the milk was going to. So I'll have to post those pictures with this podcast, John. It's heartbreaking for me to see that, because you know how hard those dairy farmers work, and any farmer, how hard they work for their product, whether they're tilling their stuff under because they can't sell it, or whether they're pulling the bulk tank because no one's picking it up because there's no market for it right now. Just heartbreaking. So.
Yeah, it absolutely is, and that's Middle America, and like you said, Paul, those 2%. But it's not even, and even beyond the demand, where there is the demand now, there's that supply chain of getting it out to distributors, that's extremely lacking right now. My cousin, and Wayne, you mentioned your buddy, I've got a cousin here in Montana with us right now, but her husband are dairy and hog farmers out in Minnesota. There's a big one out there, and they have all this product, they have all the markets it's got to go to, but all the distribution is just locked up and stopped at the processing plants, the trucking routes. And so they're doing the same thing. They're letting crops that are spoiling go. It's heartbreaking, and they actually have a market they just can't get to. So to your buddy in New York, guys, it's just the same deal. And you think of and Paul, to your point, you think of all the different things that have to be in play together to keep what we take for granted going. There's a lot of moving parts to this machine. Mm-hmm. And we barely dismantled just part of it with this COVID thing, and it's very easy to dismantle more of it. It's not comforting,
It wouldn't take much more to dismantle it all the way.
It wouldn't, buddy. It wouldn't at all, guys. I agree with that wholeheartedly, and we're feeling it firsthand with, like, Wayne, your buddy that's a dairy farmer in New York, and I got cousins doing it. Paul, I'm sure you know a lot of folks out there, outside of our line of work in agriculture production and cattle and livestock and things like that. Middle America suffering the worst, and then the end user just not getting it. It wouldn't take much more, like you're saying, Paul. I don't agree. I agree with that wholeheartedly.
Right.
No doubt. So, no, thanks, Paul. I really appreciate it. I did tell you could tell the story how we met. If you still want to do that,
I do.
I gotta hear this, Paul. Come on, man. I gotta hear this coming into this fresh.
John, I'm sure you've experienced Wayne's wholehearted laugh all the time, and
I know.
I hadn't met him prior to this night. I had come up to the North Country in the beginning of 1998 as a trooper, and I was just thrown into moose accidents, and we didn't really have moose in the part of the state. These big black beasts, and so I get a call for a moose crash, and so I'm going out to it, and Wayne was on duty also, and he had ended up coming out to the moose crash. He had a trailer on the back of his truck, and he was going to help me out with getting the beast out of the road. And so hey, how you doing? I was a fishing game guy, and kind of heard of him because of his history and his story, but didn't really know him yet. And so we get this moose onto the trailer, and he's like, "Follow me. I got to go in the back road or whatever." And so I follow him. We're in believe we were in Errol, which is pretty rural. And so we go down this dark dirt road, and he's like, "Hey, can you hold the flashlight for me?" I'm like, "Sure." So got this big, smelly, hunking carcass thing on the trailer, and he rolls up his sleeves and he starts cutting at the stomach and the chest, and he's reaching in there with the knife, and I'm just holding the light, and I'm like, and so he's hacking at something, and he goes and he looks back at me and he says, go get me a plastic bag in the center console of my truck. So I went in the center console of the truck, I got a plastic bag out. He goes, all right, open it up and hold it open. And he's doing something in there. And he comes out with this steam, because it was cool out that night. It's just this big part. Blood's leaking out of it. It's steaming. It's still twitching. And he puts it in the bag. And I said, oh, you going to bring that to the lab for testing? Or he goes, hell no, I'm going to eat it. And I couldn't believe anyone was going to eat that thing. And I thought he was screwing with me. I'm like, yeah, right. And he's like, no, I'm going to eat it. It's good. And I'm like, yeah, okay. And so anyways, he cleans up, we leave. And it just so happens that I think it was the next night or the night after, one of the other police officers that I had just met was having a birthday party at his camp up in Pittsburgh. I was on duty again. So I stopped in, and lo and behold, Wayne's there. He's off duty, and he's frying up the heart.
Oh, yeah. Party
pan,
favors.
And
Absolutely.
he's eating it, and it's not even cooked. And I told him he was going to get worms. He goes, nah, I do this all the time.
There might have been some alcohol involved in that, too.
Well, brother, you got basically Game Warden 101. You know, you got immersed in our crazy lifestyle on that first stop. And yeah, that was a good one.
And then the other part to it, John, is I go to training like weeks later, and there's a bunch of troopers in the training. We're at the police academy, and they're like, Wayne Saunders, and all these heads turn and look at me. And I'm like, yeah, right here. And you know, they're like, do you know Paul Rella? And I'm like, yeah, I know Paul Rella. Are you the guy that eats moose heart?
Yeah. Dude, I think I saw
There's my
you,
reputation.
You were like Magua in that last of the Mohicans movie, man. You're just
That's
crazy.
Right.
It's yeah. Wayne, i.e. Magua Sanders.
That's right.
Right.
And Paul.
Well, it was always a big joke when I used to go down to training in Concord, because they thought Coos County was the end of the earth. And most of the time it was snowing, because it snows almost every day. And I'd get down to Concord. They'd be mowing their lawns like this time of year already. And my cruiser would be covered with salt. And they're like, oh, what did you leave yesterday morning to come down here? So they were fascinated with the different kind of lifestyle, because it is a different lifestyle up there.
It is.
Yeah.
So, of course, that story about Wayne and the moose heart, it was great. So everybody remembered it.
Yeah, no doubt.
Well, good first meeting, man. I'm glad I finally get to know the legend, man. Wayne said a lot of good things about you, and appreciate meeting you, at least digitally. And sometime when all this pandemic mess settles down and I make it over to the East Coast to see Wayne, I hope to visit with you, man. It's
absolutely. We got to hang out. Absolutely.
Let's do it.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah. Good to know you, man. It's been a pleasure. I really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Paul, because it's vital information for everybody, and you know, somebody's going to benefit from this podcast. There's no doubt in my mind. I'm going to benefit from this podcast, so I really appreciate it. So.
And Paul, if you want, hit me up on an email, and we'll talk about getting you set up with a Trailblazer knife if you want one of those.
That sounds great. I will do that.
You got it, man. Fellow knife connoisseur out there. I didn't know. Even better.
Oh yeah.